Well, again, a program now about the world crisis, which centers on the Ukraine. To get a sense of the fact that it is indeed a world crisis, consider events in two countries in Asia. There's been a major political and governmental crisis in Sri Lanka, where, as a result of rising food prices and other cost of living problems, the government has now had to resign after intense protests. And there is also a political crisis in Pakistan, where the Prime Minister Imran Khan has sought to keep Pakistan out of the conflict in Ukraine, but has, as a result, faced a no-confidence vote in the Pakistani parliament, with clear indications that this has been, to some extent, influenced by and supported by the United States. There have been comments by US officials, including apparently the US ambassador to Pakistan, involving themselves in this political crisis. Imran Khan faced a no-confidence vote in the Pakistani parliament. He was able to delay that with the help of the deputy speaker, and he's now asked the president to call elections, which the president has agreed to do. The issue has, as of the time of the making of this video, been appealed by the opposition, however, to the Pakistani Supreme Court, and we'll see what kind of decision that makes. But on the face of it, this looks like a clear attempt to topple a government that is taking a line on the Ukrainian affair, which the Western powers, first and foremost, the United States, are not happy with. Each of these crises, the crisis in Sri Lanka, the crisis in Pakistan, would deserve a program in and of themselves, but of course, as they are subsumed in that larger crisis centered on Ukraine, it is upon that crisis that I will focus again on this program. Now, briefly, I would say that there's been much going on in the last 24 hours, but as has become traditional, I'm going to start with the situation on the ground. And here there's been big news from Mariupol. This is this town which has been the target of this intense fighting between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and which the Russians, unlike their practice in all the other big cities in Ukraine, which they have at various times in this conflict encircled, this particular city, which is part of the Donetsk region and is therefore claimed by the Donetsk People's Republic, the Russians have sought to storm. It's also an important symbolic city. It is a city which was reoccupied after it rebelled against the government in Kiev in 2014. It was reoccupied by the Ukrainian military. The force that recaptured it was the force that eventually evolved into the Azov battalion, which is perhaps more properly now the Azov regiment, or some people say it's even, in terms of scale, more properly a division, with forces located in many different parts of Ukraine. Anyway, this force, its headquarters, its name, Mariupol, is a city on the Sea of Azov. It's a port city on the Sea of Azov, a major steel center, a major center for Ukrainian exports. Mariupol, being on the Sea of Azov, its recapture was what ultimately gave the Azov battalion its name. It commemorates the fact that it was able to recapture Mariupol, the city on the Sea of Azov, back in the crisis in 2014. So that's the situation. That's the overall picture with respect to Mariupol. Well, I've been doing many programs about Mariupol. I've explained in various programs how the forces of the Russians and their allied forces from the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic and the Chechen forces brought there by the Chechen chief minister Ramzan Kadyrov have pushed the Ukrainian forces into the industrial regions with the Russians and their allies now in control of all of the residential parts of the city. And in fact, there's been a video by the journalist Patrick Lawrence which shows him now in the centre of the city, not far from the drama theatre, which was the topic of much debate and discussion earlier in the war. And it seems that the Russians have at least tentative control of by far the greater part of the city, though it does seem that there may be snipers in various places, and a complete clear out of all parts of the residential areas of the city have not happened. But anyway, there's been big news from Mariupol, because an entire unit of the Ukrainian army, this is the first time this has happened in this war, an entire unit of the Ukrainian army has engaged in a mass surrender, or so the Russians claim. This is a battalion of the Brigade of Ukrainian Marines, which alongside the Azov forces was stationed in Mariupol. And the Russians have provided pictures of what they say are the surrendered Ukrainian soldiers, and they say that the total number of soldiers who have surrendered in this battalion numbers 267. And there's also been film published in Russia of interviews with some of these soldiers. I've seen one of them, and I have to say the soldier looks very young. Allegedly, the Russians claim that this unit, before it surrendered, had suffered 50% casualties over the course of the fighting. In dead and wounded. I'm not able, obviously, to confirm this, but this does seem to be a genuine surrender of an entire Ukrainian unit, and it further suggests that the battle for Mariupol is now in its closing stages. Now, I want to make a larger point now about the Battle of Mariupol and compare it to the fighting that has that went on earlier this month and in March and at the very end of February in and around Kiev. Now, if those of you who follow the Duran on our main channel, will know that yesterday we did a major live stream with Scott Ritter, former Marine officer, former US intelligence officer, former head of the inspectors, the UN inspectors in Iraq, somebody who was able, over the course of a live stream that lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes, to give us massive and superb insight on the conflict in Ukraine, the military aspects of the conflict in Ukraine. And incidentally, if you want an informed and expert view on the conduct of that war, one which I cannot myself claim to give, as I've said many times, I'm a civilian with no background in the military and not much knowledge of military affairs. Well, if you want an expert view and analysis of this conflict, definitely that live stream with Scott Ritter is the place to go. He provides a detailed account of every aspect of this war from a military angle. But he did make 2 points which stood out for me. Now, he said that the total number of troops that the Russians and their allies have devoted to the capture and storming of Mariupol is around 40,000. Now, that is roughly in line with my own guesstimate, which I made in a program a few days ago. Now, I guesstimated in that program that the force was somewhere between 30 and 50,000 men. This all based on the assumption that there were 14,500 Ukrainian troops in Mariupol, as the Russians claimed. And, of course, Scott Ritter's estimate, which I suspect is a lot better than just a guesstimate. He will have a better understanding of these things than I do. His estimate of 40,000 is bang in the middle of that guesstimate of mine of between 30 and 50,000. But that was an interesting estimate from Scott Ritter about the number of troops the Russians have committed to the capture of Mariupol, because Scott Ritter also put the number of troops that the Russians had committed to the area around Kiev in late February and March at around 40 to 50,000. Now, Kiev has a population 10 times greater than Mariupol. It is a vast, sprawling city. I'm told that its territory is considerably larger than that of New York, for example. And one must assume that the number of Ukrainian troops defending Kiev must have numbered orders of magnitude more than the 14,500 men that the Russians said Ukraine had positioned in Mariupol. Now, if that is correct, and I'm sure that Scott Ritter's figures are correct, because I have to say they correspond with my own estimates, and it makes absolute sense to me, then that, it seems to me, conclusively demolishes any theory or suggestion that the Russians had serious plans of storming Kiev. If they needed or felt they needed 40,000 men to storm a city of 300,000 to 400,000, which is Mariupol, garrisoned by 14,500 Ukrainian troops, then they would not have committed, then they would surely, if they'd intended to storm Kiev, have committed a far bigger force, multiples greater than the 40 to 50,000 that Scott Ritter says they assembled around in the northern areas around Kiev, if they'd really intended to storm Kiev, a city with a pre-war population of 3.5 million and much vastly larger area than Mariupol, and one, moreover, which was surely defended by a very much bigger Ukrainian force. So I think that this must confirm indirectly the fact that when the Russians say that they were not planning to storm Kiev, they were telling the truth. Now, I make that point. I think it's a fairly obvious point. I'm sure there will be many people who will dispute and challenge it. If they want to come up with different figures for the number of Russian troops in and around Kiev, then of course they're free to do so. But I would point out that the Pentagon puts the total number of Russian and Allied troops in Ukraine at 200,000, and I'm now seeing what I consider to be credible views that this is a very large overestimate and that the total force may be closer to half that number. If that is correct, though, if we act on the Pentagon's figures, if there were 40,000 Russian troops encircling Mariupol and 50,000 or more troops, and more than 50,000 troops encircling Kiev, say 100,000 troops, well, that would mean that the Russians and their allies would not have had significant numbers of troops anywhere else in Ukraine. So I think that Scott Ritter's calculations are correct, and as I said, in terms of Mariupol, they correspond closely with mine, and not to labour the point further, they do demolish, to my mind, conclusively any idea that the Russians had any serious plan to storm Kiev. Now, it's not just in Mariupol that events in Ukraine are taking place, but there's been information that there's been significant advances by the Russian military south of Izium, that more Russian forces are being gradually concentrated in the area of Donbass, and there's also reports that the forces of the Donbass militia, the militia of the Donetsk People's Republic, that they're also making significant advances in parts of Donbass as well. But I'm going to before I proceed with this, touch on one other point about this war, which has, to be straightforward about it, puzzled me. And this is that I discussed a couple of days ago my bafflement at why the Ukrainians refused to give themselves credit for this incredibly daring raid that they carried out on the oil refinery, the Russian oil refinery in the Russian city of Belgorod, because that did seem to me to be a daring and successful raid, one which I would have thought would raise morale in Ukraine and which the Ukrainian government might have been expected to make much of. Well, I think that we now have the answer, because in the days after that raid was carried out, the Russians launched retaliatory strikes on 2 oil refineries, one in Odessa and another in Kremenchuk, and it seems that it is these 2 refineries that provide most of the diesel and other oils which are used in Ukraine. I am assuming that there was some sort of tacit understanding between the Russians and the Ukrainians over the course of this war that if the Ukrainians did not attack the refinery at Belgorod or other oil refineries on Russian territory, the Russians in return would leave Ukrainian oil refineries alone. Someone in Ukraine apparently decided to disregard that understanding and launch this strike on the oil refinery at Belgorod. The Ukrainian government was clearly unhappy. It seems as if 2 generals, who may or may not have been connected with this raid, but the coincidence of their sacking is striking. 2 generals were promptly sacked. 2 Ukrainian generals were promptly sacked. But the response from the Russians, despite that sacking, was to go ahead and strike these 2 Ukrainian oil refineries. And that, I'm afraid, probably means that the fuel crisis in Ukraine is probably going to get worse over the next couple of days, though I should say that there's some suggestions that the strikes on these refineries was not perhaps quite as extensive as the one on the strike in Belgorod, which may suggest that the Russians continue to act with some measure of restraint. In the meantime, there'd been some speculation that the Zelensky government was going to call off the negotiations with the Russians following the alleged claims about the events in BUCHA. There's even been some suggestions that those events in BUCHA were publicized in the way that they were in an attempt to derail the negotiations, where it's known that some Western governments, primarily the British, are becoming increasingly concerned that the Ukrainians are making substantive concessions on NATO membership and other such things. Well, today the news has come that Zelensky's pressing ahead with the negotiations. He's actually recalibrated his negotiating team. Various people who were on that negotiating team have been removed and replaced by others. And I wonder again whether this is perhaps a reflection of concern on the part of Zelensky and some of his officials that some of the members of the negotiating team were leaking information about the negotiations to Western governments, with the result that the progress of the negotiations was becoming the topic of discussion in some Western media outlets, notably the Financial Times. Well, that's, of course, speculation. I can't comment on it. So if the events in BUCHA were intended to wreck the negotiations, then it seems that they have not, at least not so far, done so. In the meantime, I'm going to return one last time, at least for the time being, to the events in BUCHA. And I'm going to say that the more information that trickles out of that town, the more skeptical I am becoming of some of the claims that are being made. I've seen photographs of what, for example, is supposed to be a mass grave. Now, of course, I'm not present. I'm only judging this from photographs, but it doesn't seem to me as if it is a mass grave on anything like the scale that is being alleged. And the Moon of Alabama and other outlets have now been casting serious doubt about the timeline of these events, and it's been interesting that the British government has acted, no doubt in concert with other Western governments, to block discussions of events in Bucha at the UN Security Council, despite Russian requests for a meeting of the Security Council to discuss them there. As I've said many times, and as we discussed over the course of that live stream on the Duran with Scott Ritter, this affair in Bucha cries out for a proper independent investigation. Unfortunately, all the evidence is that nothing like that is taking place. The investigation is very much under the control of the Ukrainian authorities. The European Union is saying that it's sending investigators to Bucha to review what's going on, but it's clear that those investigators will continue to work alongside the Ukrainian investigators as part of a single team. I suspect, by the way, that the reason that the British blocked the meeting of the Security Council is that the Russians were probably intending to press at that level for an independent investigation, a proper independent investigation carried out by third parties of what was happening in Bucha. There was a high probability that the Russians would get support from many of the countries, the non-aligned countries on the Security Council, conceivably even a majority. It's clear that the Western powers don't want that to happen for whatever reason, and that's why they blocked the meeting of the Security Council. I'm afraid I don't think that we're going to get that sort of independent investigation that I would like to see and which Scott Ritter would like to see. And therefore, I'm sorry to say, I don't think there's any realistic prospect that we're going to have an investigation of these events in Bucha that will come up with any objective assessment of the events there. I would finish on this particular issue by saying that President Biden's comments yesterday about war crimes trials and his hint that President Putin of Russia might himself be a target of such a war crimes trial would once upon a time, and not so very long ago, have been considered completely unacceptable. I say that because many would see them, and once upon a time virtually everybody would have seen them, as a form of political pressure on the various investigative agencies to actually open a war crimes investigation and to bring proceedings on that basis. Now, investigators and prosecutors are supposed to act without political interference. Once upon a time, that was considered sacrosanct. It's been a long time, well, some time since that was the case, and President Biden's comments, I'm afraid, are just another example. Whether such a war crimes investigation is ever brought and what the outcome will be is another matter. At the moment, I have to say, I think it is problematic from a legal point of view, but we shall have to wait and see. In the meantime, I would say that it was interesting that Biden did at least refute the allegation that what took place in Bucha was genocide. I have long argued against the overuse of that label to describe what might otherwise be serious crimes. And here we had, for once, from the president, an exercise of moderation and restraint, though I wonder for how long. Anyway, all of this has been happening against a background of more actions by Western governments. The United States has now finally decided that it's going to block dollar payments through US banks of Russian sovereign debt. Now, Russia still has 30 days in which to decide whether or not to pay that debt, and it might do so in dollars. But the Russians have said up to now that they would do it in rubles if they can't pay in dollars. And if the United States sticks to that position, I suspect that that's probably what the Russians are going to do. Whether the United States will try to block that and whether creditors will accept payment in rubles. The ruble at the moment, by the way, is fairly stable despite this news, remains to be seen. Simultaneously with this action by the United States, the German government has moved to confiscate the German branch of Gazprom. This is the branch of Gazprom which supervises the underground gas reserves that Gazprom has up to now had in Germany. Now, if you think that both of these actions are a petulant response, both to the strengthening of the ruble and to the fact that the Russians are apparently succeeding in their gas for rubles initiative, which I've discussed and explained in many places, and which it seems the Europeans are gradually coming round to working with. If you think that's a petulant reaction to that, well, I think these moves probably are. But in the German case, I suspect it's influenced by something further, which is that I think that the Germans are desperate to fill those underground reserves before the winter, and that they're worried that Gazprom isn't going to do that, despite the fact that Gazprom has been pumping more gas to Europe over the last couple of days. So we'll see what this pans out. Now, I would make here another general observation. In my opinion, both the freezing of the Russian central bank's reserves and the seizure of the Gazprom subsidiary in Germany both violate the principle of sovereign immunity. Both the central bank and Gazprom are, after all, owned by the Russian government. I would argue, therefore, that these are both illegal measures. I'm not sure upon what possible basis the German government has, what was the legal basis upon which the German government acted in taking this step. No doubt all kinds of legal reasons will be given, but I doubt that they would have been sufficient or seen as sufficient once upon a time in order to justify a seizure of a company in this way, a state-owned company owned by the state of another country in this way. These were the sort of acts that once upon a time governments could only legally make in time of war. But of course, Germany and the United States are not formally at war with Russia. So we see how another extraordinary step has been taken, a further step towards what I have to say I think is ever greater illegality, as Western governments find that what they had assumed to be the top point of the escalator of sanctions that they imposed back at the end of February is not turning out quite as they expected. So they are being pushed in order to try to find ways to make these sanctions more effective than they're turning out to be. They're being pushed into ever more extreme and, in my opinion, illegal acts. And I really do wonder how far this is all going to go. and what damage it's going to do to the international legal system and to the international financial system before this process finally reaches its end point. But there we are. It's inevitable that that's perhaps how things would go when we embark on a sanctions war against an adversary who is far stronger and more resilient and better organized than one suspects anybody in the West fully expected. And at the same time, it's becoming increasingly clear that with every one of these steps, the spectre of recession and higher inflation in the West looms ever stronger. So these latest steps have a petulant look about them. They also have something of a desperate look about them. We will see what happens next, and of course I will keep you informed about that. But I would say in a situation of